So first allegation, yeah. So first allegation that gets thrown out every time is they say that terrorism na abruptly start hua tha 1989 mein. Before that, everything was hunky dory. People were holding hands and singing Kumbaya, and Kashmiriyat was like all over the place. There was Kashmiriyat in your arms, Kashmiriyat was in your shirt, Kashmiriyat was in your pant. Everywhere there was Kashmiriyat. So what is it?
Yeah. You cannot, the problem with understanding Kashmir really is that where do you begin? That's the main problem. Where does the history begin? Does history begin in 1989, 90? Does history begin in 86 when Anantnag massacre happened? Does history begin in 1953? And I'll tell you why these dates are important. Does history begin in 1947? Or does history really begin in 14th century when Islamic conquest of Kashmir happened? So, for historians and for myself and for all those people who are interested in having scholarly discussion on Kashmir, you really have to go back a very long time because honestly, the story of Kashmir is also the story of dwindling demographics, right from the Islamic conquest. So, but for the purpose of this podcast, because we don't have all the time in the world, and we can always do this again in a different, because we're talking about this current thing in wake of the film Kashmir Files that has been released, and a lot of people have a lot of questions. So we will start from 80s. Let's make that a convenient point, not because history starts there, but for purposes of this discussion, it might be useful to sort of peg it there, and then we can in other discussions we can talk about stories in the past. The terrorism, and I, because I was there, and it's very difficult for people to I see a lot of people, there are more experts about Kashmir than there are Kashmiri domiciles or Kashmiri residents or Kashmiri people. That's what happens. जब बहुत ज़्यादा conflict कहीं पे जाता है, when conflict becomes as long as conflict of Kashmir has been, then experts also increase exponentially. People who do not know where Kashmir is on the map, they also become, Kashmir experts. People who don't understand that people of Kashmir are inherently different from people of Jammu, and people of Jammu are different from people of Ladakh, even though they become experts, which is fine. This is a free country. But terrorism cannot be, usually a date is given to terrorism, which is December of 1989, December 8 of 1999. That's when Rubaya Said, daughter of then Union Home Minister Mufti Muhammad Said, was kidnapped, his younger daughter. And that's one date that is given. Then there is the date of 19th January 1990, which Kashmiri Hindus often talk about because that is the day that it really came down. It was a culmination of a lot of things. However, if you look at it very carefully, this had been building up. It did not happen in one day. It did not happen in 2 days. The entire history from 80s, even which I have personally witnessed, it was never, even when Hindi cinema was capturing Kashmir as Yash Chopra's Kashmir and doing all these film songs there, and talking about doing all those talking about Pashmina and talking about Shikara and talking about all that, this very idyllic picture of Kashmir that was portrayed to the rest of India. And that's why I think this shock happened, because you only saw Kashmir till then through the movies. And you only saw beautiful slopes of Gulmarg, you only saw mountains, you only saw Hindi film heroines dancing in the forests and on the streams, and you never understood what was going on there. The story of micro minorities, by the time we're talking about 80s, Hindus of Kashmir had already been reduced to micro minority. We were about 4-5% of the population already. So you can imagine how a micro minority, most people, it's hard to visualize, but when you are a micro minority in a mostly Islamist state, or an overly Islamic background or a state, it is stifling. It is very, very difficult to even breathe. And I have given these examples. I have said that even the identity, it was very common to sort of not go out with a bindi on your head for women. Or I've already said that, or they would wear bindi in their houses or at places they knew they were secure, but in public transport they would, take off their bindis. Tiny things like that. Young boys were told that if you are playing a game of cricket with the neighbors, don't get into trouble. Always stay out of trouble. If anybody ever says anything to you, just stay out. Don't say anything. Come back home. My aunts would tell that to their teenager sons. Um, it was if not a feeling of siege which came later, but early 80s was a feeling of a very strong feeling of being a minority in a very hostile majority. That was already there even in early 80s. And slowly, the tallest leader of Kashmir, as they say, Sheikh Muhammad Abdullah, in his autobiography, Atish Chinar, had already referred to Kashmiri Hindus as fifth columnists. He had already referred to them as agents of state. He had already called them, mukbirs, or people who are, in other words, an impediment to what he would not say was Islamization of Kashmir. So most people thought that this bunch of people here, they work as agents of Indian state. They're all mukbirs of Indian state. They are all impediments for us to make this an Islamic state. That always existed. So there was always that fear. However, armed struggle nahi thi. There was in early 80s, still 81, 82, 83, the guns had not come in. That came later when, because Ziaul Haq had planned that the latest round of Kashmir, the tragedy that we see, or the terrorism, was hatched by Ziaul Haq, because it was, even though Bhutto had already given a ward for 1,000 cuts, bleed India by 1,000 cuts, but going by that policy and Ziaul Haq had finally said that we are going to create these camps in POK where people will be trained and they will come and they will lead an armed struggle against Indian state. Ye baat to thi. Why was Ziaul Haq successful? Because Pakistan has always been plotting against India. Ye koi nayi baat to nahi. They only exist to destroy India in their own minds. Because of which they're only destroying themselves, as we can see even to this point. Pakistani army only exists to tell people that they exist to fight India in some mythical war where they're going to win, which is not going to happen. But they have this notion that is their raison d'etre. That's why they exist. Why was Ziaul Haq particularly successful in that period is because Indian government under Rajiv Gandhi from 1984, remember he came to power in 1984 to 89, when he had complete power, 400 odd seats in Lok Sabha, his Kashmir policy was so messed up and so wrong that he really became a partner to Ziaul Haq's mission, if you understand what I'm trying to say. So in 1984, by this time, problems had already started. We were already living under, hostile majority, so to speak. Then suddenly we saw that boys from 15, 13, 14, 15, 16, this age group, they would disappear, our neighborhood, because we lived in neighborhoods with Muslims. I mean, especially me in Srinagar, we lived in a neighborhood where there were Muslims all around. So my mother would go to a local milk wala and say, "Where is your son?" They would say, अरे वो ट्रेनिंग करने गया है. This was very common. So my mother would come and she would say in her earnestness and in her this thing that, oh, Farhan ka beta, he has gone for some engineering training, because that is all she understood. Training engineering की होती है. So she thought engineering की training करने गई है. She would say, I'm so happy for him. You know, he has gone to study, get a degree of engineering. And then she would come another day, you know, but she's a newspaper वाले का बेटा भी गायब है. उसको वो भी engineer बनने गया है. So then, you know, people were asking, where have they gone? It only became clear later that all these young boys were going across the border and getting trained. It was so easy for them to go across the border. So you can imagine what Indian state was like. It was so easy for them to go across border that there were buses and there were you know, bus conductors would say, जैसे नाम लेते हैं ना जगहों का, लाजपत नगर, बसंत नगर, this, that. वहां पे they would say, the bus conductors would say, Sopor, Handwar, Apor, which means Sopor, which is a city in, which is a place in Kashmir. You must have heard about it. And then Handwara, which is in North Kashmir, another. Sopor, Handwar, these are all on the border. Sopor, Handwar, and Apor, that means Uspar. So there were people actually in public discourse, this was going on, that buses were carrying you from the border, from the Kashmir's border, they were carrying you to POK and they were going very easily. So all this was going on. In 1984, Jagmohan comes in Kashmir, and we will talk about Jagmohan in detail later, because he is the most important person to understand and the most vilified person. So I would really like to spend some time about, you know, Jagmohan in a bit. But he had already warned in his letters and in his communication as governor in Jammu and Kashmir, he had already warned that something is not well. Because he probably had intelligence at that time, and he had already warned Rajiv Gandhi that something is going on. I don't know what it is, but somebody needs to investigate, and I cannot investigate even though I am the governor, because the entire machinery has collapsed. Even though, because remember, we were going through a lot of turmoil. Farooq Abdullah came in 1982 after his father died, and then his government was dismissed. His brother-in-law, Ghulam Muhammad Shah, who's commonly known as Gul Shah, he came. So there was a lot of turmoil going on. But if you were to say that terrorism began in 89, that's not true. It had been building up with lot of you know, things being said verbally to Hindus, which nobody takes into account. But if you look at which I have been doing a lot, I have been trying to understand what genocide really means. So you will understand the first step of genocide really is othering the other person. That's how it starts. So othering had already started from a long time ago, but even I remember that in 80s, othering had already started. It was already me, us versus them, and you are the enemies, and somehow Kashmir belongs to us, had already started. Then in 1988, where does the violence start? In 1988, there was a first massive blast in telegraph office, Central Telegraph Office. There was a first massive blast. And at that time, it was carried out by JKLF. And not many, I think it was July 31st and August 1st, the night of that. And many people who understand Kashmir and who studied, they say that this was the start of armed resistance, or, you know, this was the start of terrorism in Jammu and Kashmir. The blast changed everything in Kashmir. Not for ordinary people. They were still not understanding what was going on. But in the annals of power, in the corridors of power, now they had started to understand something is going on, although they were not willing to do anything at this point. Dozens of Kashmiri youth had already crossed the line of control, and they had now, which I was telling you, they had now returned with bombs and bullets. Then a very interesting thing happened after this bomb blast had happened. There was sudden death of Pakistani President General Zia-ul Haq. This happened on August 17th, 1988. You'll be surprised to know, Kushal, that Pakistan, because I remember this very clearly, Pakistan remained peaceful. There was no curfew in Pakistan. But in Kashmir, of all the places, curfew was imposed. There were
Shabash.
anti-India and anti-Russia protests were held in different parts of Srinagar for several days because they knew that present insurgency was the brainchild of General Zia, so they were all out protesting. Remember, Pakistan remained calm. It was in Kashmir that curfew was imposed. Electricity nahi thi, and for days we lost power. I remember, but that happened in August of '88. Then in September of '88, there was another blast. That shook the valley. It was there was an attack actually on the house of DIG Kashmir Ali Muhammad Watali in a very posh neighborhood of Rajbagh. His terrorists from JKLF, they attacked Watali's residence, and in retaliatory action, I think one founder member of JKLF, Ajaz Dar, he was killed. And when he was killed, there was a recovery of automatic weapon from the encounter side, and this created ripples because no automatic weapons had been recovered from the site at that point. So this is 1988. So we know all that was going on. Then Farooq Abdullah started releasing terrorists. Even before Rubaya's incident, he had released 70 dreaded terrorists who had been after these, in incidents, they used to call them gunmen. People who used to be picked up by, J&K police, he would release them. And he would give the thing of J&K against कोई case नहीं है. Nobody is, making a case against them in the court. But who would make a case against them in the court? It's government's responsibility. He was not allowing any case. In fact, I don't know if you know the name. Then these names are very common to us, but Beta Karate and Yasin Malik, now all of you know. But there was another this thing. Remember, Yasin Malik was called Gandhi of Kashmir by our friends in left liberal intelligence. Yeah, and this is after he had admitted to killing so many Hindus and even including IAF officers. There was another terrorist, Shabir Ahmed Shah. So there's another actually, he's still alive. And he was called Mandela of Kashmir because he had been put in jail for a while after that. And he had been put in jail after a while. But when he was picked up in 1988, when he was picked up on the intelligence report, I think there was an IB report or CID report against him, and he was picked up. Nobody came to the court Advocate General never came against the court to make a case against him from the state's side. So there was total capitulation of state even before Jammu had come, or even before Rubaya Saeed came. Rubaya Saeed incident happened. When Rubaya Saeed's incident happened in September 8, 1989, that was complete capitulation of state, and complete capitulation doesn't happen in a day. It had already been happening. It's just that people were not noticing. Remember, in September of 1989, the most prominent Kashmiri Hindu leader, who was the head of BJP state unit, Panditika Haltapilu, was shot dead. After that, just Nilkant Ganju was shot dead. So it was, these things had already happened much before, Rubaya Saeed's kidnapping. And of course, after Rubaya Saeed's kidnapping, there was complete mayhem and the state capitulated. But it's wrong to say that it started somehow. There's a date. I cannot put a date to it. I know it was building up. There was no date that it started on. Remember, there are reports, and I'm sure intelligence reports in India have these reports, that on 26th January 1990, terrorists backed by Pakistan were supposed to declare independent Kashmir on 26 January 1990. That was the plan. So all this was happening towards that plan. That's why 19th January happened, and that's why all these incidents happened, because they were supposed to declare an independent Kashmir on 20. That was the date that had been assigned, 26 January 1990. Of course, things didn't pan out the way terrorists wanted. So
Hmm.
that's to
No,
say that it started on a day or something.